U-2 crisis, 1960. The spy plane shot down above the USSR. Hello and welcome. Before we delve into the heart of this story, a question to consider. In a world teetering on the brink of nuclear annihilation, what is the true price of a secret? If you were a world leader, what would you risk? Men, machines, even peace itself, for a single piece of information that could change everything. Share your thoughts on what you believe is an acceptable cost for national security. Now let us turn the clock back to a time when the world held its breath and a single flight threatened to ignite a global firestorm. The year is 1960. The Cold War is not just a geopolitical concept. It is a chilling, daily reality. The United States and the Soviet Union, two titans armed with city-destroying weapons, are locked in a struggle of ideology, espionage, and technological one-upmanship. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who had commanded the Allied forces in Europe, is desperate to know the true extent of the Soviet military machine. He is haunted by the fear of a bomber gap, and more recently, a missile gap. Are the Soviets, under the boisterous and unpredictable leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, truly outproducing the West in nuclear delivery systems? Is a surprise attack, a nuclear Pearl Harbor, a genuine possibility? To find out, he had sanctioned one of the most audacious and technologically advanced espionage programs in history, a program run by the Central Intelligence Agency under the codename Project Aquatone. The centerpiece of this project was a remarkable aircraft, the Lockheed U-2. It was less a plane and more a powered glider with a massive wingspan and a lightweight frame designed for one purpose: to fly higher than any Soviet fighter or surface-to-air missile could reach. From an altitude of over 70,000 feet, 13 miles up, its powerful cameras could photograph the ground with astonishing clarity, revealing military bases, missile silos, and nuclear facilities. The pilots were a special breed, recruited by the CIA for their skill, nerve, and ability to endure long, solitary hours in a cramped cockpit, clad in a full pressure suit like an astronaut. One of these men was Francis Gary Powers, a former Air Force captain. He was quiet, professional, and deeply committed to the mission he believed was vital to protecting his country. For 4 years, the U-2s, nicknamed Dragon Ladies by their crews, had flown with seeming impunity over the Soviet Union. They were specters in the stratosphere, their contrails occasionally spotted by baffled Soviet pilots who could only watch helplessly as these untouchable intruders mapped their nation's most sensitive secrets. The Americans grew confident, perhaps overconfident, in their technological superiority. The U-2 was, they believed, invincible. But invincibility is a myth, and technology is a relentless race. The Soviets, humiliated by these repeated violations of their airspace, were pouring immense resources into developing a weapon that could finally reach the Dragon Lady. As the spring of 1960 approached, a crucial East-West summit was scheduled in Paris. Eisenhower hoped it would de-escalate tensions and lead to a treaty on nuclear testing. But he needed one last look. The intelligence on a new potential ICBM site near Plesetsk was too vital to ignore. Despite growing concerns within the intelligence community that the Soviets were getting closer to a solution, the decision was made to authorize one more flight. It would be one of the longest and most dangerous U-2 missions ever attempted, flying from a CIA base in Peshawar, Pakistan, clear across the industrial and military heartland of the USSR to land in Bodø, Norway. The date was set for May 1st, May Day, the Soviet Union's most important national holiday. The pilot chosen for this fateful mission was Francis Gary Powers. In the final briefing, the risks were laid bare, but so was the objective's importance. Powers was equipped with a modified silver dollar containing a poison pin, a last resort in case of capture and torture. The official cover story, should anything go wrong, was that it was a NASA weather research flight that had strayed off course due to oxygen equipment failure. It was a flimsy story, but the assumption was that if a U-2 were ever hit, neither the pilot nor the sensitive equipment would survive the fall from 70,000 feet. It was a gamble based on an assumption that was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. As Powers suited up in the pre-dawn hours, the fate of the upcoming Paris summit, and perhaps the world, rested on the gossamer wings of his aircraft. The pre-dawn air in Peshawar, Pakistan was thick with a nervous energy that belied the mission's routine facade. For Francis Gary Powers, the process was familiar, a ritual he had performed many times before. The low-calorie, high-protein steak and eggs breakfast, designed to minimize gas and discomfort at extreme altitude. The lengthy, arduous process of donning the partial pressure suit, a claustrophobic silver-skinned cocoon that was his only shield against the lethal environment of the near vacuum where he would spend the next 9 hours. As CIA technicians helped him seal the helmet, the world outside became a muffled, distant place. His universe shrank to the hum of the suit's life support and the myriad dials and gauges that would soon be his only companions. The aircraft waiting for him on the tarmac, Article 360, was a creature of breathtaking fragility and immense power. Its long, slender wings, stretching 80 feet, seemed too delicate to lift the fuselage and its powerful Pratt & Whitney J527 engine. The U-2 was notoriously difficult to fly at low altitudes, earning it the Dragon Lady moniker. It was prone to stalling and had a bicycle-style landing gear that required a chase car with another pilot to torque the plane down, calling out altitudes as it settled onto the runway. But in its own element, the stratosphere, it was a peerless queen. At 6:26 a.m. local time, Powers taxied to the runway. He pushed the throttle forward and the U-2 surged ahead, its long wings flapping slightly before generating enough lift. It leaped into the air with an eagerness that always felt unnatural for an aircraft of its size. He was climbing, steeply, towards the heavens, leaving Pakistan and the familiar world behind. He crossed into Afghanistan and then the invisible line that marked the border of the Soviet Union. The landscape below flattened into a vast, abstract map. He was at 70,500 feet, a godlike perch from which he could see the curvature of the Earth, the deep indigo of the sky above bleeding into the blackness of space. Down below, life went on, oblivious to the single, silent eye passing overhead. Powers settled into the rhythm of the long flight. The autopilot, a sophisticated system known as the Blue Box, handled the minute corrections needed to stay on the precise, pre-planned course. His job was to monitor the systems, the fuel consumption, the oxygen flow, and most importantly, the complex camera systems mounted in the bay beneath him. He would manually turn them on and off as he passed over primary and secondary targets. He passed over the Aral Sea, a shimmering expanse of blue. His first major target was the Tyurata missile test site, the facility from which Sputnik had been launched. He flicked the switches, and the cameras began their work, their lenses capturing images that intelligence analysts in Washington would scrutinize with microscopic intensity. Everything was proceeding flawlessly. The Soviets knew he was there, of course. Almost as soon as he crossed the border, his aircraft would have appeared as a faint blip on their early warning radar screens. He could imagine the frantic activity in the air defense centers below, the alerts being sent up the chain of command to Moscow itself. Soviet fighter jets, MiG-17s and MiG-19s would be scrambled, their pilots pushing their engines to the limit in a futile attempt to reach him. He had seen their contrails far below on previous missions, angry white streaks clawing at the sky but falling thousands of feet short. It gave him a sense of detachment, of untouchable solitude. He was a ghost in their machine. But as he flew northeast towards the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, a hub of Soviet military production, something changed. The autopilot began to act erratically. He disengaged it, taking manual control of the delicate aircraft. It was a demanding task, flying the U-2 on the coffin corner, that narrow performance envelope at high altitude where the stall speed and the maximum speed are only a few knots apart. Flying too slow would cause a stall. Flying too fast could tear the fragile airframe apart. As he concentrated on keeping the plane stable, he was unaware of the far more sophisticated response unfolding on the ground. The Soviets had been waiting for this. They had moved their newest, most advanced surface-to-air missile system, the S-75 Dvina, known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline, into position along the U-2's likely flight paths. It was a weapon specifically designed to do what their fighters could not: reach into the stratosphere and kill the Dragon Lady. Down on the ground, near Sverdlovsk, the atmosphere in the command bunker of a Soviet PVO, Air Defense Forces missile battery, was electric with tension. For years they had tracked these phantom intruders, their radars painting a target they were powerless to engage. The frustration had mounted with each violation, a direct insult to the might of the Soviet military and a personal humiliation for the men tasked with defending the motherland's skies. But today was different. Today, they had the S-75 Dvina. The order had come down from the highest levels: destroy the target at any cost. As Francis Gary Powers wrestled with his U-2's temperamental autopilot, his aircraft appeared as a clear, high-altitude target on their radar scopes. The tracking was solid. The missile crews worked with practiced, feverish intensity, their actions a symphony of lethal purpose. The target was within range. The commander gave the order: Pusk! Launch! The first missile roared to life, with a deafening clap of thunder that shook the earth. The two-stage missile leapt from its launcher on a pillar of fire and smoke, accelerating rapidly as it clawed its way into the thin upper atmosphere. It was a guided thunderbolt, a technological marvel of its own, streaking towards a target 13 miles away. In the cockpit of his U-2, Powers heard a dull, resonant thump behind him. It wasn't a direct hit. The missile hadn't struck the aircraft itself. It had detonated in close proximity, just as it was designed to do. Its warhead was a fragmentation type, intended to fill the sky with a cloud of shrapnel. A violent, brilliant orange flash filled Powers' canopy, momentarily blinding him. The shockwave slammed into the U-2, a colossal, invisible fist. The delicate airframe, not designed for such forces, was mortally wounded. The long, graceful wings were torn from the fuselage and the tail section snapped off. The aircraft was instantly sent into a violent, inverted, and uncontrolled spin, plummeting towards the earth. Powers was thrown violently against his restraints. The immense G-forces pinned him to his seat, a crushing weight that made every movement an agonizing effort. His first instinct was to activate the plane's self-destruct mechanism, a block of explosives designed to destroy the camera and the precious film it contained. The switches were on a panel behind him. He reached for them, but the chaotic spinning of the wreckage made it impossible. His next thought was escape. He had to get out. He fought against the G-forces to jettison the canopy. It blew away, and the brutal reality of the upper atmosphere hit him. The air was thin and frigid. He was still connected to the plane's oxygen supply, but the wreckage was now a death trap. He tried to eject using the seat mechanism, but the force of the spin was pinning his body forward, his legs trapped under the instrument panel. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was going to ride the wreckage all the way down. In a desperate act of self-preservation, he managed to release his seatbelt. The centrifugal force immediately threw him halfway out of the cockpit, but his oxygen hoses and parachute harness were still snagged on something inside. He was being dragged down with the spiraling metal coffin. He struggled, pulling and kicking, and then, at around 30,000 feet, he was torn free. The main part of the fuselage continued its descent, while Powers, now clear, fumbled for his parachute ripcord. He delayed pulling it, wanting to fall to a lower, more breathable altitude. At about 15,000 feet, his parachute deployed automatically. The sudden, violent jerk was followed by an eerie silence. The chaos of the last few minutes was replaced by the gentle rustle of the wind in his silk canopy. He was alive. Suspended between heaven and earth, he watched the shattered pieces of his U-2 glinting in the sun as they fell far below. The mission was over. His sense of invincibility was gone. He was now an enemy aviator descending slowly, helplessly into the heart of the Soviet Union. His capture was no longer a possibility. It was an absolute certainty. As Francis Gary Powers drifted downwards under his billowing parachute, the world reasserted itself with startling clarity. The abstract map he had viewed from 70,000 feet resolved into a tangible landscape of green fields, collective farms, and small villages. The silence of the stratosphere was replaced by the whistle of the wind and the distant barking of a dog. He was no longer a phantom in the sky. He was a man, vulnerable and utterly exposed, about to land in the one place on Earth he was never supposed to be. He tried to control his descent, aiming for what looked like an open field, but the wind had its own ideas. He landed with a jarring thud on the edge of a dirt road near the village of Kosulino. He quickly tried to bundle up his parachute, the first instinct of any downed airman being to hide the evidence of his arrival. But it was too late. A car had already screeched to a halt nearby. Two men, civilians, jumped out and ran towards him, their faces a mixture of confusion and suspicion. They started shouting at him in Russian, a language he did not understand. He tried to communicate with hand gestures, but the situation escalated quickly. A small crowd of local farm workers began to gather, drawn by the commotion and the sight of the strange, silver-suited figure who had literally fallen from the sky. There was no hostility at first, only a profound sense of bewilderment. They helped him out of his cumbersome helmet and parachute harness. For a few moments he was just an object of curiosity. But then, one of the men noticed the pistol he was carrying. The mood shifted instantly. He was no longer a mysterious visitor. He was an armed foreigner. The men overpowered him, taking his weapon. Soon, officials from the local collective farm arrived, followed shortly by what he correctly assumed were members of the KGB, the formidable Soviet state security agency. The initial, chaotic phase of his capture was over. He was now a prisoner of the state. The KGB agents were professional and methodical. They searched him thoroughly, cataloging every item he possessed. Their findings would become crucial pieces of evidence. They found his survival kit, containing a hunting knife, flares, and fishing line. They found large amounts of Soviet rubles as well as gold coins and other foreign currencies, a clear indication that he was not an ordinary pilot. They found his CIA-issued identification, which listed him as a driver for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the predecessor to NASA. And they found the most incriminating item of all, the small, needle-like pin hidden inside a hollowed-out silver dollar. The KGB agents immediately recognized it for what it was: a saxitoxin-laced suicide device. This was not the equipment of a lost weather pilot. This was the toolkit of a spy. Powers was taken to a local KGB facility and then transferred to Sverdlovsk. The initial interrogation began. He was exhausted, disoriented, and in a state of shock, but he tried to stick to the cover story he had memorized. He was a pilot for NASA, flying a weather research plane out of Turkey. He had experienced oxygen problems, blacked out, and his aircraft had strayed deep into Soviet airspace by accident. He claimed to know nothing more. The KGB interrogators listened patiently, their expressions unreadable. They knew he was lying. They had the wreckage. Soviet recovery teams were already swarming the crash site, meticulously collecting every fragment of Article 360. They found the high-resolution camera, its massive lens miraculously intact. They found sections of the fuselage and wings. And most importantly, they found the partially exposed but largely undamaged roll of film. When developed, that film would provide a pilot's eye view of their most secret military installations. They had the plane, the equipment, the photographs, and the pilot. The American cover story was a house of cards, and the Soviets held an ace they were not yet ready to play. Powers was transported from Sverdlovsk to Moscow and incarcerated in the infamous Lubyanka prison, the headquarters of the KGB. The psychological pressure intensified. The interrogations became more sophisticated, a relentless process of questioning, isolation, and sleep deprivation designed to break his will. He was no longer Francis Gary Powers, U-2 pilot. He was prisoner, Gore 847, a pawn in a high-stakes game of international chess whose rules were only just beginning to be written. While Francis Gary Powers was being interrogated in the bowels of Lubyanka prison, a carefully orchestrated piece of theater was beginning to play out in Washington, D.C. On May the 1st, when Powers failed to arrive at the designated time in Bodø, Norway, the CIA's station chief there sent a coded, one-word cable to headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Overdue. A chill went through the highest levels of the Eisenhower administration. They initiated their pre-planned cover story. The key assumption, reinforced by years of scientific and aeronautical advice, was that a U-2 breaking apart at 70,000 feet would be utterly obliterated. The pilot, exposed to the extreme forces and hostile environment, would not survive. The sensitive equipment, especially the camera and film, would be destroyed. Based on this fatal assumption, the administration felt it was safe to lie. On May 5th, 4 days after the shootdown, NASA issued a deliberately bland and misleading press release. It stated that one of its weather research aircraft, a U-2, had gone missing during a flight over Turkey. The statement explained that the pilot had reported difficulties with his oxygen equipment and that the last known position suggested the plane may have accidentally drifted over the Soviet border while the pilot was unconscious. It was a plausible, if thin, explanation designed to quell any speculation and portray the incident as a tragic accident. The State Department reinforced this narrative, expressing regret over any unintentional violation of Soviet airspace. President Eisenhower, a man who prided himself on his integrity, was deeply uncomfortable with the deception, but was convinced by his CIA director Allen Dulles that it was a necessary falsehood to protect the invaluable U-2 program. They were confident that the Soviets had no proof. They might have found some unidentifiable scraps of metal, but without the pilot or the camera, they couldn't prove the plane's true purpose. The lie seemed to be holding. Then, also on May 5th, Nikita Khrushchev made his first move. In a long, rambling speech to the Supreme Soviet, he announced, to thunderous applause, that an American aggressor aircraft had been shot down deep inside Soviet territory on May Day. He angrily denounced the flight as a provocative act, but crucially, he did not mention the pilot. It was a masterful trap. The Americans, hearing this, breathed a sigh of relief. Khrushchev's omission of the pilot seemed to confirm their assumption that Powers was dead. They decided to double down on the lie. The next day, May 6th, State Department spokesman Lincoln White stood before the press and elaborated on the NASA story. He repeated the claim about the weather flight and the incapacitated pilot. He even presented a U-2 painted in full NASA livery to the media at a research center in Virginia to lend authenticity to the cover story. The administration was digging itself deeper into a hole of its own making, completely unaware that Khrushchev was gleefully handing them the shovel. The entire world was now watching. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and humiliating public revelations of the Cold War. In Moscow, Khrushchev was savoring the moment. He had the Americans exactly where he wanted them. They had lied, and they had been caught. He held all the cards: the wreckage, the spy camera, the photos, and the ultimate trump card: the living, breathing pilot. He let the Americans compound their deception for 2 full days, allowing their official denials and fabricated stories to be printed in newspapers around the globe. He was not just aiming to expose an espionage operation. He was aiming to publicly humiliate the President of the United States on the eve of a major peace summit. The trap was sprung. The silence from the Kremlin was about to be broken by a political explosion that would rock Washington to its core and change the dynamics of the Cold War forever. The hammer fell on May 7th, 1960. Standing once again before the Supreme Soviet, Nikita Khrushchev began his speech with the air of a showman revealing his grand finale. He recounted the American statements, quoting the NASA cover story about the lost weather plane and the unconscious pilot. He let the words hang in the air, a testament to the official lie that Washington had broadcast to the world. A smirk played on his lips. "Comrades," he began, his voice booming with theatrical triumph, "I must tell you a secret. When I made my report 2 days ago, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well. And we have the remnants of the plane, and we also have the pilot." The hall erupted in a storm of triumphant laughter and applause. He then produced the evidence, one piece at a time, like a prosecutor presenting an open and shut case. He described the U-2's intact camera, its spy equipment. He waved copies of the photographs the plane had taken of Soviet military sites. And then, the ultimate bombshell. "The pilot is alive," he repeated, "and is testifying." He revealed the pilot's name: Francis Gary Powers. He described the suicide pin, the Soviet rubles, the full panoply of a spy's equipment. "So much for the story of a strayed weather plane," he jeered. In Washington, the news hit like a physical blow. The meticulously constructed cover story had not just been exposed, it had been demolished with theatrical flair, leaving the Eisenhower administration looking foolish, dishonest, and caught red-handed. The lie had been built on the bedrock assumption that the pilot was dead. Now, that assumption was revealed to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The embarrassment was acute and total. The credibility of the United States, and of President Eisenhower personally, was in tatters on the world stage. The immediate reaction was chaos and damage control. The State Department was forced into a humiliating reversal. On May 9th, spokesman Lincoln White had to face the press again, this time to admit that the U-2 had indeed been on an intelligence-gathering mission. The new official line was that such flights were a distasteful but vital necessity in the face of Soviet secrecy and the threat of a surprise attack. They tried to frame the missions as defensive in nature, a necessary evil to assure the safety of the United States and the free world. But the damage was done. The attempt to shift the narrative from espionage to national defense was drowned out by the global outcry over the initial deception. President Eisenhower was furious. He felt betrayed by the CIA's faulty intelligence assessment that the pilot could not have survived. He was a man who valued his reputation for honor and integrity above all else, and he had been publicly branded a liar by Khrushchev. The pressure mounted for him to take personal responsibility. In a move that was unprecedented for an American president, Eisenhower did just that. On May 11th, he admitted that he had personally authorized the U-2 program and the specific flight. He stated that the flights had been going on for 4 years and that they would continue as long as they were necessary for American security. It was a defiant stance, but it also gave Khrushchev exactly what he wanted: a direct link between the espionage flight and the President of the United States. The political fallout was immediate and severe. The timing could not have been worse. The Paris summit, scheduled to begin in just a few days, was now shrouded in doubt. What was intended to be a moment of de-escalation and hope was now set to become a stage for confrontation. Khrushchev had all the leverage. He had exposed American espionage, forced a public admission from the US president, and painted himself as the aggrieved party, the victim of piratical American aggression. The dream of a thaw in the Cold War had melted away, replaced by the chilling prospect of a renewed and more bitter confrontation. The world watched and waited, wondering if the summit would even happen, and if it did, what new crisis it might ignite. The city of Paris in mid-May 1960 was supposed to be the backdrop for a historic moment of reconciliation. The leaders of the four great powers, President Dwight D. Eisenhower of the United States, Premier Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of Great Britain, and President Charles de Gaulle of France, were gathering for a long-anticipated summit. The agenda was ambitious: to de-escalate Cold War tensions, make progress on a nuclear test ban treaty, and resolve the simmering crisis over the status of Berlin. Hopes were high that this meeting could usher in a new era of peaceful coexistence. But the ghost of the U-2, Article 360, hovered over the proceedings, casting a long, dark shadow. The atmosphere at the Élysée Palace on the morning of May 16th was thick with an almost unbearable tension. Khrushchev arrived in a state of high dudgeon, his mood volatile and aggressive. He had come not to negotiate but to dictate terms. The preliminary meeting began, and Khrushchev immediately seized the floor. He launched into a furious tirade, forgoing any diplomatic niceties. He branded the U-2 flight a treacherous act and an aggressive provocation aimed at sabotaging the summit. He read from a prepared statement, his voice dripping with indignation. He demanded 3 things from the United States. First, a formal condemnation of the U-2 flights. Second, a promise that such flights would never be repeated. And third, and most importantly, a public apology from President Eisenhower for the perfidy of his actions and a commitment to punish those responsible. He concluded his tirade by rescinding his invitation for Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union, effectively slamming the door on any further personal diplomacy between the two leaders. The other leaders sat in stunned silence. Eisenhower, a man of immense military and personal dignity, was visibly angered by the personal nature of the attack. He had already made a concession before the meeting, announcing that the US had suspended all U-2 flights over the Soviet Union and would not resume them. He had hoped this would be enough to mollify Khrushchev and allow the summit to proceed. He listened to Khrushchev's demands and then responded calmly but firmly. He reiterated that the flights had been suspended and would not be resumed satisfying Khrushchev's second demand. However, he flatly refused to issue a public apology. To do so, in his view, would be a national humiliation and would violate the principles of his office. Espionage was a fact of international life. Both sides engaged in it. The U-2 flights, he maintained, were a defensive necessity, not an act of aggression. The impasse was total. Khrushchev, seeing that Eisenhower would not bend to his will, declared that under these circumstances there was no possibility for productive negotiations. He announced that the Soviet delegation would be leaving Paris. With that, he stood up and walked out of the room. The Paris summit had collapsed before it had even formally begun. The recriminations were swift. Khrushchev held a marathon, 2.5-hour press conference, a masterful and belligerent performance in which he repeated his denunciations of American piracy and painted Eisenhower as a warmonger who had been caught in a lie. He mocked the president and reveled in the American embarrassment. The West was left in disarray. De Gaulle and Macmillan tried to salvage the situation, but it was hopeless. The opportunity for a détente was gone, replaced by a new and dangerous deep freeze in the Cold War. The collapse of the summit had profound consequences. It ended the era of personal diplomacy between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. It hardened attitudes on both sides, ensuring that the next few years would be marked by heightened tension and confrontation, culminating in the Berlin crisis of 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The dream of Paris had turned into a nightmare of diplomatic failure, all because of one man in one plane, 13 miles high. And for that one man, Francis Gary Powers, his own personal ordeal was just beginning. His fate was now sealed. He would face a Soviet court, not as a prisoner of war, but as a common spy. With the collapse of the Paris summit, Francis Gary Powers' value as a political pawn had been fully exploited. Now he was to be used for another purpose: propaganda. The Soviets announced that he would be put on public trial for espionage, an event designed not to dispense justice, but to serve as a global showcase of American aggression and Soviet righteousness. The trial was scheduled for August 1960 and was to be held in Moscow's magnificent Hall of Columns, a grand ballroom with glittering chandeliers and white marble columns that had been the stage for Stalin's infamous show trials in the 1930s. The symbolism was deliberate and chilling. The Soviet authorities assembled a case that was, from their perspective, irrefutable. They had the wreckage of the U-2, the spy camera, the developed film showing clear images of Soviet military installations, and the pilot's own espionage equipment. The trial was to be an exercise in public humiliation for the United States. Powers, meanwhile, languished in Lubyanka prison. He was held in isolation, subjected to relentless interrogation for 11 to 12 hours a day. The questioning was psychological, not physical. His interrogators were patient, methodical, and highly skilled at wearing down a prisoner's resistance. They already knew most of the answers. What they wanted was his cooperation, his confession. They showed him the evidence they had collected: maps of his flight path, pieces of his aircraft, even personal letters from his wife that had been intercepted. They slowly chipped away at his cover story and his resolve. He was given a Soviet defense attorney, Mikhail Grinev, but it was clear that Grinev's role was not to mount a vigorous defense, but to advise his client on the best way to navigate the Soviet legal system, which meant admitting guilt and showing remorse in the hope of a lighter sentence. Facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a harsh, if not fatal outcome, Powers made the difficult decision to cooperate. He concluded that continued denial was futile and would only lead to a worse fate. He decided to answer his interrogators' questions truthfully about the mission, while trying to protect sensitive information about the U-2's full capabilities and the identities of his fellow pilots. On August 17, 1960, the trial began. The Hall of Columns was packed with international journalists, foreign diplomats, and a carefully selected Soviet audience. Powers, dressed in a dark civilian suit, was led into the courtroom and placed in the defendant's box. The chief prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, the same man who had been the Soviet prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, began by reading the lengthy indictment, charging Powers under Article 2 of the Soviet law on criminal vengeance for state crimes. It was a charge of espionage that carried a severe penalty. Over the next 3 days, the trial unfolded as a piece of meticulously choreographed political theater. The physical evidence was displayed for all to see. Witnesses, including the Soviet soldiers who had tracked the plane and the farmers who had captured Powers, were brought in to testify. The centerpiece of the trial, however, was Powers himself. Speaking in a quiet, steady voice, he pleaded guilty. He answered the prosecutor's questions, describing his recruitment by the CIA, his training, and the details of his final mission. He expressed regret for his actions, following the script that he and his lawyer had determined was his only viable path. He stated, "I am profoundly sorry that I have committed this act," and acknowledged the gravity of his violation of Soviet airspace. On the final day, Rudenko delivered his closing argument, demanding a 15-year sentence. Then, Powers was allowed to make a final statement. He spoke of his family, expressed his deep regret and sorrow, and threw himself on the mercy of the court. On August 19th, the three-judge military tribunal returned with its verdict. It was, as expected, guilty. Francis Gary Powers was sentenced to 10 years of deprivation of freedom, with the first 3 years to be served in a prison and the remaining 7 in a labor camp. The show was over. The Soviets had achieved their objective, securing a conviction and broadcasting their version of events to the world. For Powers, the verdict marked the beginning of a new, grim chapter in his ordeal. He was taken from Moscow to Vladimir Central Prison, a harsh, historic facility 120 miles east of the capital, notorious for holding political prisoners. His life as a convicted spy had begun. Vladimir Central Prison was a world away from the relative professionalism of Lubyanka. It was an old, grim fortress, steeped in a history of suffering, its stone walls echoing with the ghosts of Tsarist-era political prisoners and victims of Stalin's purges. For Francis Gary Powers, this was to be his home for the foreseeable future. He was prisoner Ranka 847, stripped of his name and identity and subjected to the monotonous, soul-crushing routine of prison life. His days were spent in a small, cold cell, initially in solitary confinement. The routine was unvarying: a wake-up call before dawn, a meager breakfast of bread and kasha, porridge, and long hours of enforced idleness or menial prison labor. For a time, he was tasked with gluing together small cardboard boxes, a mind-numbingly repetitive job designed to break the spirit. He was allowed a short period for exercise each day, pacing alone in a small, high-walled yard, a patch of sky his only connection to the outside world. He was under constant surveillance, his every move watched, his every word noted. The psychological toll was immense. The loneliness was profound, a different kind of solitude from the one he had experienced in the cockpit of the U-2. This was a solitude of despair, not of power. He worried constantly about his family back home, about whether he had been forgotten, about whether he would ever see his country again. He had no news of the outside world, no idea of the diplomatic currents that were slowly beginning to shift in his favor. While Powers endured his confinement, a separate, secret drama was unfolding in the shadowy world of Cold War diplomacy. The key to his freedom lay with another prisoner, a man incarcerated thousands of miles away in a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. This man was William Fisher, better known by his alias, Rudolf Ivanovich Abel. Abel was a master spy, a KGB illegal, who had operated a sophisticated spy ring in New York City for nearly a decade before his capture by the FBI in 1957. He was a colonel in the KGB, a dedicated and highly skilled intelligence officer who, unlike Powers, had revealed almost nothing to his captors. His trial was a sensation, and he was defended by a tenacious insurance lawyer from Brooklyn named James B. Donovan. Despite the immense public pressure, Donovan provided a robust defense, and after Abel's conviction, he successfully argued against the death penalty, presciently suggesting that a time might come when the US would need to trade him for a captured American. That time had now arrived. Shortly after Powers' conviction, a secret back channel of communication was opened. A letter, ostensibly from a relative of Abel's in East Germany, arrived for James Donovan, proposing a prisoner exchange. Donovan, now acting as an unofficial negotiator with the tacit approval of the Kennedy administration, which had taken office in 1961, began a series of delicate, high-stakes negotiations with Soviet contacts, including KGB agents operating out of the Soviet embassy. The negotiations were complex and fraught with risk. The Soviets initially demanded a 2-for-1 swap, Abel for Powers, and also for Frederick Pryor, an American economics student who had been arrested on flimsy espionage charges in East Berlin. The US was hesitant. There was a strong feeling in some quarters of the government, particularly within the military and intelligence communities, that trading a high-level KGB colonel like Abel for a pilot who had been captured was an uneven deal. Some still harbored suspicions about Powers' conduct, questioning why he hadn't used his suicide pin. But President John F. Kennedy, persuaded by Donovan and eager to resolve the situation, ultimately approved the exchange. The deal was struck. The location for the swap was to be a place that perfectly symbolized the divided world, the Glienicke Bridge, a modest steel structure that connected West Berlin with the Soviet-controlled city of Potsdam in East Germany. It was a liminal space, a literal bridge of spies linking the two opposing worlds. The date was set for the early morning of February 10, 1962. After 21 months of imprisonment, Francis Gary Powers was abruptly woken in his cell at Vladimir, told to gather his few belongings, and put on a train to Moscow, and then on a flight to East Berlin. He had no idea what was happening. He didn't know if he was being transferred to a labor camp or finally being sent home. The early morning of February 10, 1962 was bitterly cold on the Glienicke Bridge. A damp fog rolled off the Havel River, shrouding the steel structure in a grey mist. The bridge, which had once been a busy thoroughfare, was now a silent, heavily guarded checkpoint in the heart of a divided Europe. The newly constructed Berlin Wall stood as a stark and brutal testament to the Iron Curtain. On the western side, in the American sector, James B. Donovan stood with a small contingent of US officials, his breath pluming in the frigid air. On the eastern side, in Potsdam, Soviet and East German officials waited with their own precious asset, Rudolf Abel. A few hundred yards away, at another checkpoint known as Checkpoint Charlie, a second simultaneous release was arranged for the American student, Frederick Pryor. The tension was palpable. This was the first prisoner exchange of its kind between the two superpowers, and anything could go wrong. At approximately 8:45 a.m., two cars approached from the east. Francis Gary Powers, looking thin and pale after his 21-month ordeal, was escorted out of one of them. He was dressed in a Soviet-issued overcoat and fur hat. He looked across the bridge and saw the small group of Americans waiting for him. At the same time, Rudolf Abel, a quiet, dignified man, was escorted from his car on the western side. The two prisoners, the pilot and the spy, stood at opposite ends of the bridge, symbols of the vast ideological chasm that separated their worlds. They were pawns in a game far larger than themselves, their individual fates determined by the cold calculus of geopolitics. A Soviet official and James Donovan walked to the white line painted at the center of the bridge to make the final identification. After a brief confirmation, a signal was given. Powers was told to walk. Abel was told to walk. They started across the bridge from opposite ends, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They passed each other at the midpoint without a word, without a glance, two ships passing in the night. Powers continued his walk towards the western side, towards freedom. As he stepped across the center line and was met by the waiting Americans, a wave of relief washed over him. His long ordeal was finally over. He was bundled into a waiting car and sped away to Tempelhof Airport for a flight back to the United States. His homecoming, however, would not be the hero's welcome he might have dreamed of during his long nights in Vladimir Central. Upon his return, Powers found himself in a peculiar and uncomfortable position. While many Americans hailed him as a hero, a significant cloud of suspicion hung over him. In the black and white moral landscape of the Cold War, there were uncomfortable questions. Why hadn't he destroyed the plane's camera? Why hadn't he used the suicide pin? Had he cooperated too easily with his Soviet interrogators? He was a Cold War Rorschach test. Some saw a patriot who had endured a terrible ordeal, while others saw a man who had failed in his duty. To clear the air, he faced intense debriefing by the CIA and a formal inquiry by the Senate Armed Services Committee. He had to recount every detail of his capture, interrogation, and trial, defending his every action. He explained that the G-forces had made it impossible to reach the self-destruct switches, and that the suicide pin was meant to be used only to avoid torture, which he had not been subjected to. He argued that he had a duty to stay alive, and that his cooperation had been a calculated strategy to survive without revealing critical intelligence. In the end, the Senate committee, led by Senator Richard Russell, formally exonerated him, concluding that he had lived up to his obligations as an American and had conducted himself as a fine young man under dangerous circumstances. He was even awarded the Intelligence Star by the CIA in a secret ceremony. But the public vindication was never quite total. The taint of the controversy lingered for years. The U-2 incident itself left an indelible mark. It shattered the myth of American technological invincibility and taught the US a painful lesson about the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of anticipating failure. It accelerated the push towards satellite reconnaissance, leading to the Corona program, which could photograph Soviet territory from the safety of orbit, eliminating the need to risk pilots and planes. The crisis derailed a chance for détente and ushered in one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War,